again, going into how the theory of constraints is more than just identifying the constraint and add it. Well, it says first of all, you try and optimize the constraint. Then you try to reassign other resources from other parts of the process or system to the constraint, and then, if necessary, get external resources. Would be the fourth step in order to relieve the constraint, and then look for the next constraint. I mean, that's classically the short version of theory of constraints, but it's so much more than that, right? Yep. And one element that is so much more than that was actually Eli Goldratt's second book, which was Critical Chain, which was making the point that in project management, we often obsess about the critical path. That is the shortest path, the shortest time that a project can be completed if you did all of the tasks stop throughout the project in the planned time, and anything that's on the critical path which is delayed will delay the whole project. And the principle there is not everything in the project will delay the project, but anything on the critical path will. But it's very much based on the time that was allocated to those tasks. And Critical Chain makes the point that the resources themselves that are doing the work can be the bottleneck, and can actually be the limiting factor in whether a project is on time or not. And so avoiding multitasking is one of them. That resources, people in the project need to be able to focus on the task at hand and not be distracted and not be pulled off on to help with other tasks. But a lot of it was about something called buffer management, and it was called buffer management in order to say that you have to, anything on the critical path has to be cannot be delayed, and therefore has to be kept busy with work. The bottlenecks do need to be fed and as much as possible be 100% utilized, as close to 100% as possible. The bottleneck. So you do keep some buffer in there in time and resources and raw materials. For example, there needs to be a buffer of raw materials. There needs to be a buffer of people's time when you're planning a project. So buffers before the bottleneck, and sometimes even after the bottleneck, in terms of space to keep the product as it's coming out of the bottleneck, needs to be thought about. And one of the points that about critical chain is that we have to recognize that there's always variation in any estimate. When we do estimates for time, for resources, we're often thinking about what the average amount of time that would be taken for a task, or the average amount of resources that would be needed. But there's always variation in reality, and with variation comes delays, comes cues, comes whip with variation. And this ties into the Lean Six Sigma principle of Kingman's law, right? Kingman was an English mathematician that recognized that the lead time through a process, which is also equivalent to the total time for a project to take, really, from the start of a project to the finish of a project, or the total time from an order to a delivery, is affected by a number of factors, but the two main factors are utilization and variation. Kingman's equation actually uses the utilization of a resource, so 0 being the utilization, the resource is not being used at all, 100 the resource is being used 100%, and he found that it's actually not healthy to have a resource at 100% utilization, because you need that buffer in order to be able to handle things when the variation means there's greater demand. So having a resource at 100% would actually mean that when there's excess demand, you then start getting WIP and you start getting backlogs and you start getting queues. So you want to have, you don't want to have 100% utilization of your resource. You want to have a buffer there, and you want to reduce variation in the supply side and the demand side, so that the flow is as constant as possible. Because the more variation there is, then you actually have to have even lower utilization in order to have good flow. Are you familiar with that sort of concept?
Yeah, and I actually kind of take that to I don't know that it'd be an extreme so much, but variation, and I guess really just variation, it occurs on multiple axes. So one of them is kind of the supply side variation. But if you think of kind of, the success or failure of like an individual operation within like a broader system is a function of all of these different sources of variation, whether it's, what comes in from the supplier, the demand in terms of what's expected of them that day, all the way down to the variation in levels of hydraulic fluid, the temperature of it in lines, and how that affects, machine torque and output and things like that. All of those things are interrelated and interact all day long. So it's not even just one axis of variation that, creates, it's that plus the next, plus all the way down to, what the machine operator deals with. So there's kind of these broad systemic problems that are the things we like talking about. And then when you get down to that person's level, all of that stuff is compounded because it's taking place over so many different axes than at the systemic level.